Marcus is a medical herbalist and medical and horary astrologer. As a herbalist, he specialized in complementary care for people living with HIV and practiced at Neil Yard's Remedies therapy rooms in London from 2007 to 2016. He was a clinical supervisor at Middlesex University's Western Herbal Medicine, Bachelor of Science and Masters of Science courses from 2013 to 2018, Westminster University and Hartwood Online herbal medicine programs from 2020 to 2023. He currently teaches at KeplerCollege, at QHP, and the Academy of Astrology based in the United Kingdom. His first book, The Secret Life of Chocolate, was released in 2020. And Marcus uses the Regiomontanus house system. And to find out more about Marcus, you can visit nocturnalherbalist.com. And Marcus, I believe there was another website as well you wanted to mention?
Yeah, just really wanted to highlight my tiny little baby YouTube channel, Plantarium. That's actually, by the way, I've changed it so it's at the at is correct there. It's plan with a little gap tarium. It's a little play on, planetarium, plants, whatever, haha. But the YouTube channel is just called Plantarium. But it's so tiny. If you search for Plantarium Astrology, and it's just myself and my colleague Ollie Rathbone, who's also a herbalist and an astrologer, and every couple of weeks we just do a video talking about herbal medicine and astrology. So we're just doing a series on Saturn transiting the sun at the moment and remedies for that and stuff like that. So if that's of interest, then I wanted to flag that. Thanks, Callum.
Absolutely fantastic. We'll put links in the chat box, and if you watch the replay on YouTube, I'll have all those links in there as well. Absolutely wonderful. Well, Marcus, it's always a pleasure, and I'm going to pass on the baton to you to begin.
Thank you very much, Callum. Appreciated. So, obviously, this presentation is about a predictive technique developed by Masha'allah, and it's a technique that I use a lot, and it's very, very useful in any form of predictive astrology, particularly horary astrology. But really, any astrology, this technique is universalizable, and it's very effective in medical astrology. There are some limitations to it, which I'll discuss. Really, they're not limitations; they're just refinements to the technique. But this technique was really, I've got a friend of mine, Charmaine Lodge, to thank for this, because I remember being in the astrology shop in Covent Garden around 20 years ago, browsing and looking at new ways to burn a hole in my pocket, as I often did after work on a Saturday. And I was trying to choose between two books, and one of the books was a little translation of Masha'Allah's On Reception, and the other was something else, I forget. And my friend said, I said, which one should I get? I can't make my mind up. And Charmaine said, get that one. And I did. And I'm so glad I did, because this technique has made the difference between me getting a prediction correct and not several times. So it's very valuable. And that's what I'll be teaching today. And hopefully I'm hoping that this webinar will go online on the Kepler channel, so that I'll be able to anytime anyone asks me for more detail about this technique, I can direct them to this webinar, because I will be covering this technique in the upcoming course on prognosis. But it's only one lesson that I can spend on it, because there's a whole bunch of other techniques in the course, of course. So this webinar will be a bit of an expansion of that, providing a bit more detail, and it's just going to be generally useful to astrologers, I hope. So, all right, so let's begin with who was Masha'allah. Well, he was just an 8th, 9th century medieval Persian Jewish scholar called Menacer, rendered as Masha'allah bin Athari in Arabic. He lived from 740 to 815 AD and was born in Basra, Iraq, a prolific astrological author, drawing on Hellenistic sources like Ptolemy and Dorotheus, but Indian as well. So he used what we'd now refer to as Vedic, or some of the earlier sources from there, and Persian sources as well. And very famously, he's one of the team of astrologers who elected the founding of Baghdad. And I remember a few years ago, there was a talk by an astrologer. He wrote, I can't remember, Nicholas Campion, that was it. He wrote a couple of books on the history of astrology, very good books. And he did a talk about this chart, and it's a fascinating chart. A bit of a side note, if you want to do a bit of research on that chart for the election of the founding of Baghdad, considering it was elected by a team of astrologers, it's an interesting chart, because they've got things you'd expect to see, like a very strong ascendant with Jupiter rising in Sagittarius from memory. But it's got some bizarre features, like it's got Mars in Gemini on the descendant. So it's almost like they they built in the city being attacked, and it was in fact attacked and sacked a couple of times, and it was always rebuilt. And there's some speculation as to why that might have been, because all of those astrologers were highly competent. So it might have just been that classic electional scenario where you've just got to pick the best time in a shorter window of time, you know. So it's often, electional astrology is often about finding the least worst time rather than finding the best time. But anyway, bit of a side note for you there. He was certainly a very competent astrologer, as I'll be showing you some of his example charts from his book later in this presentation. And I'll be bringing in a chart of my own as well to show you how these techniques work. A brief word on the sources for this talk. I've looked mainly, of course, at Masha'allah's work on reception, and I've used two translations of that. I've used the translation by Ben Dykes, Dr. Ben Dykes, wonderful astrologer, of course, and I always refer to him as the Terminator of translation because he's relentless and he just keeps translating these amazing works. And then the other one is Robert Hand's fantastic translation as well, which is the one that my friend Charmaine induced me to pick up in Covent Garden years ago. And those are my main sources. But secondary sources, I've also used a bit of Guido Bonatti's, Ben's translation there, Libra Astronomia, and you'll see why. That's just to add a bit of very important nuance to the technique. And I've also used John Frawley's The Horary textbook, which in my personal opinion, is the best instructive textbook for Horary. There are many other excellent ones. Lee Lemon's written one. Barbara Dunn's book I consider to be excellent. There are lots of good ones, but I think John's is the best. His idea of reception, as I'll go on to discuss, is controversial because he sort of looks at it the other way round from many astrologers, but I don't think in the end it makes a great deal of difference, practically speaking. And if I remember, I'll speak on that. But anyway, those are my main sources. So Masha'allah, one of the quotes from the book, I've got to, every time I touch a button, it moves slides. The joining together of the Lord of the Ascendant is itself the acquisition, and reception is its delight. What that means, very simply, is that the Lord of the Ascendant is the ruler of the rising sign. So let's say you have, Libra rising, Venus is the Lord of the Ascendant. If you have Leo rising, the Sun is the Lord of the Ascendant. And so when that planet is joining another planet, when it's aspecting another planet, when it's applying to conjunct or conjoin another planet, that means it is acquiring something. It's engaging with something like a circumstance or another person. Something's happening. So the Lord of the Ascendant ruler applying to another planet by aspect or conjunction, it's acquiring something. Something is happening to it. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing will depend on many factors, which we'll talk about. But the key point here, and this is a quote from Masha'allah's on reception, of course, is reception is its delight. When it receives that planet, it wants it, it enjoys it, it desires that thing. So I will expand on that and we'll define reception in a moment, but that's a key point. So what is reception? So this is Masha'allah's definition. I think this is from the Robert Hand's translation, this one. Sorry, I keep trying to move this thing at the bottom of my screen. That's it, got it out of the way now. So in the causing of whether things will be or will not be, reception occurs because of exaltations and domiciles. That is, one of the 7 planets is in the exaltation or domicile of a second planet, and the first planet is being joined to the second according to one of the 7 recognized aspects, or they are both in one sign, and one of them is in the exaltation or domicile of its comrade and joined to it. That is a pretty good explanation. It's just a long way of saying you've got an aspect between 2 planets or a conjunction, and one of them is in the sign of the other or the sign of the exaltation of the other. Example, and this is an example from Masha'allah's book on reception. He says you've got Mars applying to conjoin Saturn in Aries. Mars receives Saturn, but Saturn does not receive Mars. So Mars receives Saturn because Saturn is in the house of Mars. It's like Mars is in Aries, he's in his own home. He's applying to Saturn, he's receiving Saturn. Saturn is a guest in Mars's house. But Saturn, of course, does not receive Mars. In fact, this is an example of something I call rejection as well, which I will get onto. There was no traditional term for this, except sometimes it was called not reception, but I think a more accurate and useful term is rejection, which I'll get onto. But Masha'allah gives this as an example of Mars receiving Saturn. The second example he gives, and I think this is a better one because there is no not reception or rejection involved, is he says there's Mars at 10 Capricorn applying to square Saturn at 20 degrees of Aries. And here, Mars and Saturn will be in mutual reception. I think this is fairly clear. They're in each other's signs or domiciles. Mars in Capricorn ruled by Saturn, Saturn in Aries ruled by Mars. So what's interesting about this is they're applying by square, which is a stressful or challenging aspect. Traditionally, a trine was said to be an aspect of ease or complete love, although that can be a bit misleading because, as I'll expand upon in a moment, really whether a planet loves or does not love another entirely depends on the reception. The aspect merely describes the way in which the two planets come together. So if it's a trine, it's easy. You can have an easy coming together of two things that don't like each other or are actively bad for each other. But a trine tends to be the easiest, most harmonious aspect in the sense that the things will at least superficially agree and the event will happen with ease. You don't have to do anything. It will happen naturally. A sextile, a little bit of effort is often required to make the possibility occur, but it will happen relatively easy if you just step 1 foot out of your comfort zone. A square is a challenging aspect. There may be some struggle or resistance or friction or effort, and an opposition is an aspect of maximum resistance. This is, again, traditional astrology. Some modern authorities differ, but all of the traditional authorities agree on this, that an opposition is a very difficult aspect, and often the two things can be brought together temporarily with separation or perhaps with regret. There are some exceptions to that but generally opposition involves the maximal degree of friction, if you like. And a conjunction, the two things are united in the same house, and it depends on the planets and lots of other factors as to whether they get on or not. They're just sort of staying in the same house, so they're together. Anyway, the point here is that even though this is a square between Mars and Saturn, and of course, Mars and Saturn, the traditional malefic planets, and they were called the malefics because they are the most extreme in their nature. Saturn is the most extremely cold, if you like. Mars is the most extremely hot. Saturn is so cold and Mars is so hot that they describe things that are sort of inimical to human health, like, having an ice bath or having a sauna in small doses can be very good for you if you're healthy. If you're not healthy, not recommended, and spending too long in either, also not recommended. So Saturn and Mars can be very useful if they're used in small measure, but in excess, they are naturally too much. That's why they're called malefics traditionally. It doesn't mean that they're useless or bad. It just means their nature is too extreme to comfortably support human life and health. So when you've got the two combined, it's always a challenge. But this is kind of like, this is kind of like an obstacle course or an army training exercise thing. This would be a good aspect to have for some sort of, when you wanted to put yourself through an ordeal and level up, because you've got this strong Mars in Capricorn squaring that admittedly weak Saturn, but they both really like and support each other, but with a square, which involves a lot of effort. So it's kind of like, as I say, an obstacle course or an ordeal that you enter in deliberately, and you want to do it to level yourself up. You're training for some triathlon or something. This would be a very constructive aspect for that kind of thing. All right, just before I get into a bit more detail, because I'm just going to run through all the techniques and the principles first before we get into the charts. This is just a quick run through of the traditional order of the visible planets. Now, in my own practice as an astrologer, I do use the trans-Saturnian planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Chiron. I don't really use any of the other bits of space lint. Occasionally, I'm not averse to them. I'm not allergic to an asteroid, but I don't generally use them. But of course, they're significant. If there's Pluto on an angle or it making a tight aspect to something, it's important. But traditionally, of course, they just use the 7 visible planets, so-called, or the 5 visible planets and the 2 luminaries, because they were all visible to the naked eye. And this is symbolically important because if it has light, if it's visible to the eye, then you're consciously aware of it. And I think, the trans-Saturnian planets, arguably, they all represent forces and powers and processes that are incredibly powerful, but may often operate below the level of consciousness and are often only completely clear from the vantage point of history. With hindsight, you can see, oh yeah, that massive Pluto transit that everyone was going through, or that was hitting my chart that year. During the time, it felt like I was going through hell, and it probably was. But in retrospect, this is what it meant. And even as an astrologer, sometimes you can describe what it means, but it's not always fully clear from the ground. The 7 traditional planets, or the 5 traditional and the 2 luminaries, you can see those processes a bit more clearly, at least in theory. And the important thing about this slide is there was a traditional order. And this order, of course, is based on how close they are to the Earth and more or less how quickly they move around the sky from our point of view. But it's also an order of authority. It's a hierarchy of power. And so we go Saturn, then Jupiter, then Mars, then the Sun, then Venus, then Mercury, then the Moon. The reason this is important is because of this authority thing. Who has the final word? And this can come in interpretation sometimes when you want to see which planet can modify another. So the way this applies to reception is, all else being equal and in general, you want the planet that's higher up this food chain, the planet that has more authority, the slower moving planet, to receive the faster planet, or to receive the faster moving planet. Now, if a faster moving planet receives a slower moving planet, that's still helpful. It still shows that there's some mitigation, but it's not quite as helpful as if the heavier planet receives the light. So in that example that Masha'allah gave of Mars in Aries applying to conjoin Saturn, that's in a way the wrong way round. Is it helpful that Mars receives Saturn? Yes, because it means Mars can modify Saturn. Saturn is a guest in Mars's home in Aries. So Mars has a bit of authority over how that Saturn behaves. But it's like Saturn is a guest who has more status than Mars. It's like Saturn is the governor of the whole kingdom, as it were, and Mars is a lower ranking official. And so Saturn is being a guest in Mars's home and behaving really badly. Mars can say something about it, but he can't totally tell Saturn what to do because Saturn has more authority. So it is always more effective to have the higher up planet receiving the lower down. In terms of power, traditionally it was said that Saturn and Jupiter have approximately the same level of power, and Mars and Venus have a very similar level of power. But if there's a fine balance, you always want to go for the one that's a bit higher up. The slower moving one has more power. So that'll come in a few of the examples, I think. So all that preamble over with, what is Masha'Allah's technique? And he lays this out in detail in On Reception, which if you haven't read, I recommend that you do. It's a small book, but there's a lot of material in it. So what he lays out is there's a relay of aspect, and you work from Lord 1, and that L1, short for Lord 1, that just means the ascendant ruler, the ruler of the sign on the ascendant. So like I say, if you've got Scorpio rising, that'll be Mars, the traditional ruler of Scorpio. If you have Pisces rising, that would be Jupiter, the traditional ruler of Pisces. If you have Libra rising, that would be Venus, the traditional ruler of Libra, and Virgo rising, it would be Mercury, and so on. So Lord 1 just means the ruler of the sign on the ascendant. And you're working from either that planet, because that planet is always the avatar or representative of the person, of you, if it's your birth chart, or your patient, if it's a consultation chart, or the querent, meaning the person asking the question, if it's a horary chart. Or you're working with the moon, because the moon is always the backup. The moon is always generally signifying where events are going, and also secondly represents the person whose chart it is, unless there's specific circumstances. For example, if Capricorn is rising and it's a horary chart where you're asking about marriage, or the querent is asking about marriage. In other words, it's a person asking about their partners, because in that case, the seventh house is the house of marriage. Cancer will be on the cusp of the seventh house, and therefore the moon signifies partner in that case. So if it's somebody asking a question about another person, particularly like a marriage partner or a specific work colleague or somebody they're engaged in a lawsuit with, and they've got Capricorn rising, then the moon is primarily representing that person. But in every other circumstance, you're really going to be looking at the ascendant ruler and the moon as their backup. And then in this technique, he looks at where those planets go, what they aspect, and then it's like a little relay race of aspects. So the ascendant ruler goes on to aspect that planet, then that planet goes on to aspect another one, until you get to the final dispositor, which is the last planet in that relay race. And usually that's one of the slower moving planets, like Saturn or Jupiter. Sometimes, very occasionally, it's a faster moving planet. Like, let's say you've got Venus in an angle and you've got Cancer rising, then maybe the moon goes to aspect Mercury, and then Mercury goes to aspect Venus, and then Venus doesn't aspect anything else before she leaves the sign. And Venus is at the beginning of a sign or something like that, or in a fixed sign, which traditionally indicates slowness. So you can sometimes have a planet lower down that traditional food chain. But often it's one of the slower moving visible traditional 7 planets. For this technique, ignore aspects to outer planets. Now, you can build them into your interpretation later, but in terms of this prognosis, we are only using this technique specifically. We're only using the planets visible to the naked eye. So he'd look at the final planet and that last planet in the chain, and I'll bring up plenty of examples in a moment to show you how this works in practice. The last planet in that aspect chain will show the final outcome, and any aspect in the race that goes on between that will show what events go on leading up to that outcome. So he says, Masha'allah says, that the acquisition of the desired outcome can be shown by the ascendant ruler or the moon. And I've put desired first degree or second degree, or primary or secondary. Primary desired outcome means the actual thing that the person wants to happen. A secondary desired outcome means maybe not exactly what they want to happen, but still something that they're happy with, or like, okay, cool, that's fine. Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes we don't get exactly what we want, but we get something close to what we want. And that can be okay. And you can show either of those with this technique. So what you want is the ascendant ruler or the moon aspecting any planet representing the desired thing. So that would be the ruler of the sign on the house that you're asking about. So say if the person wanted to find a partner and you had the ascendant ruler applying to any aspect of the 7th house ruler. So say we had Cancer rising, then the moon would be the ascendant ruler. Say you'd have Capricorn on the 7th house, so Saturn would be the ruler of the 7th. If the moon was applying to aspect Saturn, then that would indicate some kind of desired outcome, even if there's no reception. It would indicate some kind of contact with that person. Now, it might be an opposition without reception, which means you might just have a massive fight with them, but will you come together with them? Yes, obviously much less pleasant than a nice trine, but you know, will it happen? Yes. If you're aspecting any planet in the house of the thing that you want. So same example, let's say the person wanted a partner or a relationship. If you had the moon in this example applying to trine or sextile or square or oppose even any planet in the 7th house, and it was received. So let me give you an example of that. So say you got Mars in the 7th house in Capricorn and the moon was in Scorpio. Oh no, bad example actually. Let's say the moon was in Aries. So let me change that. So let's say we had either of those examples isn't going to work. Let me give a different example. And you know what? I'll give it more nuance later on because I'll come on to the rejections piece in a moment. Any planet in the 7th house. So let's say we had Venus in Capricorn and the moon was applying to any aspect of Venus. That would give the person some kind of relationship or connection with the 7th house. Or if it was a person wanting a job, and you had the ascendant ruler applying to any aspect of a planet in the 10th house, that would give potentially access to the job. So really an aspect to a planet in the house. Now, there are some caveats, which I'll go on to in a moment. So hold that thought. But if there's reception, that's going to guarantee it. So let's say you had, in the example of a partnership, you had Cancer rising, the moon would be in Taurus applying to trine Venus in Capricorn. That would guarantee some kind of connection with the person. Or if you had, maybe the moon would be in Scorpio applying to sextile Mars in the 7th house, there would be a reception because the moon would be coming from Scorpio. So obviously, the Venus in the 7th would give a smoother relationship than the Mars in the 7th, but both of them would give the person access to the relationship or the connection with the other person that they want. Aspecting, and so that's primary. Both of those with the moon aspecting the 7th, the ruler of the house that you want, or the ruler of the sign on the house that you want, or the ascendant ruler or the moon aspecting any planet in that house with reception, that will give you that thing or access to that thing. An example of a secondary desirable outcome, like not exactly what you want, but sort of acceptable in the right ballpark, would be the ascendant ruler or the moon aspecting any planet anywhere in the chart with reception. Like let's say in this example, the moon was in Virgo, applying to sextile Mercury in Cancer. It's like, well, that would give the person something that they want. It might not give them exactly the partner or the partnership that they want, but it'll give them something that they actually want and are happy with. And likewise, the ascendant ruler or the moon aspecting Jupiter or Venus with or without reception will tend to give them something that you want, because Jupiter and Venus, the two benefics, generally want to say yes. They generally say, yes, you can have this. They might not give you all of it. They might just give you part of it, but they'll generally want to say yes. But again, as I say, there are some circumstances in which that may not work. And so let me give you examples of how these things work in practice. So here are a couple that I've made up with vastly simplified charts where I've just taken out everything else that could complicate the picture. And these are both made up examples of, say, somebody applying for a job and they've asked a horary question, will I get this job? So we're looking at the 10th house as the house of career, and we're looking at the ascendant ruler and the moon. Well, I've made it really, really simple by choosing Cancer rising. So they're the same planet. So we're only looking at the moon. Where's the moon going? And in example 1 on the left of the screen here, we've got the moon in Gemini at 12 degrees Gemini. So that might be in quadrant houses. That might be in the 11th house or the 12th house. Whole sign, obviously, it'd be in the 12th, but in quadrant houses, it might be in the 11th or the 12th. But it's applying immediately to aspect Mercury in the 10th house of the job. Let's say, for the sake of argument, this Mercury in Aries, let's say Mercury in Aries is in the 10th quadrant house as well as the 10th whole sign, just to make this as simple as possible. And there is a reception there. So yay, this person gets access to the job. Perhaps they get asked for an interview. So they're immediately got aspect. But we're saying in this example, Mercury is direct. The very next aspect Mercury makes is an opposition to Saturn in Libra. And that Mercury is in Aries, and Aries is the sign of Saturn's fall. That is an example of what I call rejection. So even though Saturn in Libra is pretty well behaved for Saturn, it's the best behaved Saturn you're ever going to get, it's going to say no. So this might be something like, yes, you'll get an interview maybe in a week or within the month, because it's within 1 degree, let's say, of Gemini. Gemini mutable signs are usually sort of a medium time frame, like a week or a month, something like that. But then you might get, might not get the job because maybe somebody you're competing with could beat you for the job, because we've got Capricorn on the 7th. So that might be the scenario. That's one example of how this could play out. The second example, same scenario. We've got the moon, the ascendant ruler, in Capricorn, in her detriment. Traditionally, the moon didn't like being in Capricorn at 12 degrees, applying to the square of Saturn in Aries in the 10th. And we're saying in these examples that no other planet is going to get to Saturn before the moon does here. If any other planet got to Saturn before the moon, say another planet just aspected Saturn before the moon got there, let's say Venus made a sextile to Saturn, let's say Venus at 14 degrees and 55 minutes of Saturn just aspected Saturn before the moon had time to perfect that square, Venus would cut the moon off. That's traditionally called an abscission of light. Unless Venus represents something that the moon actually wants, in which case Saturn will bring Venus and the moon together. That's slightly beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's a couple of techniques I'm going to point you towards called abscission of light. Abscission just means cutting off, when you've got another planet with more authority that's higher up the food chain, perfecting that aspect before the planet you want to get there gets there. But interestingly, that abscission, if Venus is something that the moon wants to get to, like if Venus ruled a sign on a house that they wanted, let's say this person was asking about, will I meet my friend? And Taurus was on the cusp of the 11th house, then maybe Saturn would bring Venus and the moon together. And that's called a collection of light, when a heavier planet collects two lighter ones. And the difference between an abscission and a collection of light is entirely context, which is why one of the many reasons I keep saying astrology is a fully context dependent art. A chart which in one circumstance could represent something you don't want, in another circumstance or in another context could represent something you do want, which is why a birth chart where, you might have, oh, this planet's in detriment, it's terrible, it's not good. Well, in a bunch of scenarios, it might not be good, but in another particular scenario, it might be exactly what's needed. This is something that John Frawley, one of the phrases that he uses that I love is Saturn in Cancer can represent a sick person, a bad man, or a perfectly functional umbrella, which I like a lot, because saying Saturn in Cancer, this weak Saturn, could represent somebody who's sick. Maybe they've got chest problems or digestive problems, that's Saturn indicating blockages or coldness in the lungs or in the stomach or in the liver. It could represent a bad person, like Saturn as the malefic in a cold sign, or it could represent an umbrella, a barrier, Saturn, to wet, which is Cancer. So it very much depends on how you're using things, which is why birth charts, if you ever see somebody reading a birth chart like, oh, that's terrible, that's good, it's like this all depends on the context. And over a lifetime, you've got a big amount of time to play with, seeing how these things can come out. In a horary or in a medical situation, often the scope of the chart is narrower. So you're examining it for a much smaller period of time and for a narrower question. So things, they're not necessarily black and white, but there's a lot more, you can potentially get a bit more predictive juice out of them. And that's not to say that any of this is fated or set in stone. I'm not a fatalist. I think you've always got room as an astrologer to look in the chart and see what you can advise that the person can do to help them beneficially modify the situation. I think that's why we do it, really. But it's an important side note. Anyway, back to my made-up example here. This second example, moon in Capricorn, applies to square that Saturn in Aries in the 10th. Person's going for this job. Will they get it? Answer, absolutely yes, because Saturn receives the moon. Now, this is fascinating because both of those planets traditionally would be said to be weak, because the moon would be in detriment in Capricorn, Saturn is in fall. What that actually says is, if we assume that Saturn here is the final dispositor, is that the job might be a bit crap. It might not be that much fun. When the person gets the job, they might kind of end up hating it. There might be a really tyrannical boss or a load of responsibilities that they just don't want. But do they want that job? Absolutely they do. That's what the reception is showing. Will it take some effort to get it? Yes, because the aspect is a square, an aspect of putting in a lot of effort. So remember, the aspect shows how they get there. The reception shows, do they want it? And then the state of the planet at the end shows, what will it be like? So on to why you don't get the thing that you think you want, we've got the ascendant ruler, or the moon, or the planet that you're looking at, is applying to aspect Mars or Saturn without any reception. So if Mars and Saturn, the two malefics, the two extreme planets, don't receive, they're not going to give you it, because they kind of want to say no. Venus and Jupiter want to say yes. Mars and Saturn want to say no. It's just their nature. If they receive you, they will reluctantly give you the thing that you want, probably with terms and conditions. I'll give you a little anecdote about that in a minute, but they'll give you it. If there's no reception, they generally won't, unless Mars or Saturn rules the house of the thing that you want. That trumps other considerations, with the exception of rejection that I'll come on to. So generally, if Mars rules the house of the thing that you want, so if Mars rules the 10th house and it's a person asking about a job or to give an illness related thing, if the 10th house of medicine, if Mars rules the medicine, the person is going towards that medicine. If the ascendant ruler or the moon is applying to aspect Mars, will they get it? Yes. Or will they go there? Yes. So if Mars or Saturn rules the house, then you'll get the thing. And if Mars or Saturn is in the house of the thing that you want, and it's well dignified and not retrograde. So generally speaking, Mars in, when it's well behaved, Mars in Aries or Scorpio or Capricorn, or Saturn in Libra or Aquarius or Capricorn, will give you the thing that you're asking for, even if they don't receive you, if they're in the house of the thing that you're asking about and the ascendant ruler of the moon is applying to aspect them. Again, rejection will negate this, and I'll talk about rejection in detail in a moment. So hang on. So generally speaking, Mars or Saturn will say no unless they rule the house that you're asking about. So if you're asking about a friend, if they rule the 11th house and the ascendant ruler of the moon goes to aspect, say Capricorn is on the cusp of the 11th house, and Saturn represents your friend. If the moon or ascendant ruler is going to aspect that Saturn, then you'll meet your friend, that kind of thing. Failure or reversal. So that Mars and Saturn, if they don't receive, if they're not in the house of the thing that you ask about and dignified, or if they don't rule that house, will say no. They'll just say no to it. But you can also get the thing, and then the thing can reverse or can go backwards or can not work out well. And that's when the final dispositor, the planet that's at the end of the chain, is retrograde. If the planet is moving backwards, that often means you'll get the thing, but then it will reverse, because retrogradation means reversal. Also, if the planet is in a cadent house, that means if it's in one of the houses that are a bit weaker, that those would be traditionally particularly the 6th and 12th houses, but also the 9th and 3rd, because they're falling away. That may mean you'll get the thing, but it might take longer to get it, and then it might not last as long as you want, because cadency has this feeling of like it's only on 20% battery. So it takes a while, it takes longer to charge up, and then it's like a really old phone, you know, it takes ages to charge and then it loses charge really quickly. Those are the cadent houses. So it doesn't mean it ruins the thing, it just means that it might take longer for you to get it, and then when you get it, it doesn't last. Although sometimes cadent houses, because they have this sense of falling, mean you get it really quickly, but then it tends to fall away quickly as well. Again, it all depends on context and what makes the most sense in the context, but cadency is weak generally. And then the quality of the outcome is judged by what the essential dignity and placement of the final dispositor. As in the little made-up example I just showed you, that Saturn in Aries in the 10th represented a job that was really difficult. And actually, Masha'allah gives an example of a person applying for a job where the moon
sorry,
is
Marcus,
in...
just to interrupt. You are putting out just a little bit at times. I think it's the internet connection, just to make you aware.
Oh, sorry about that. There's nothing I can do. Have you missed anything important there?
No, it was only for like a second or two. So hopefully the internet gods will keep with us.
Well, Callum, just let me know if I do. Thank you. And I'll repeat and just let me know if we miss anything, and I'll just go back over that thing. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll move on because I don't want to spend, because I know I'm spending too long on this bit and we've got quite a lot to cover. So a couple more made-up examples, bearing those things in mind. Again, will I get the job in these examples? Again, I've chosen the Cancer rising, so we only got to look at the one planet, the moon. So in the first example, we've got the moon in the 12th house, or 12th sign, certainly, applying to sextile that Saturn in the 10th. Will the person get the job? The answer here is a resounding no, because Saturn does not receive the 7th house, does not receive the moon, and it's in a crappy state. Now, if that 10th house, if Saturn was in Libra or was in Capricorn or was in Aquarius, then Saturn would do it reluctantly, but it would do it. It might be like you have to complete a bunch of forms and wait ages, and they'll make you sign loads of stuff and go through loads and loads and loads of interviews or something, but it'll give you the job. Saturn in Aries is not going to do it because it doesn't receive the moon. Now, if that moon had been in Capricorn or in Aquarius, squaring or sextiling that Saturn, then Saturn would have given them the job. But this might be one of those cases where be careful what you wish for, because if the person was applying for the job and then got it, they might wish they hadn't, given Saturn in Aries, the state of it. So, but yeah, this would be a no. And then on the right, we've got the moon in 10 degrees Cancer, so very strong, applying to square Mercury at 12 degrees of Aries. And then Mercury is direct, applying to conjoin Jupiter. So the moon is applying to aspect a planet in the 10th. Let's say again, Aries is the 10th house as well as the 10th sign. That would give the person an interview or something. It would definitely give them access to the job. Mercury's not going to say no. It's not a malefic. It's not going to be easy because it's a square, but the moon has lots of dignity. The moon has lots of ability. It's very strong where she is. And then Mercury conjoins that Jupiter in Aries. The benefics say yes, but Jupiter is retrograde. So that would be something like person makes a bunch of effort, gets an interview, gets given the job, and then like 2 months later, the company goes into administration or they have a shake-up or something like that, and the job gets dissolved. You know, something that the job had, they get it, and then something about the circumstance reverses and they no longer have it. So it's not terrible, but it's just like, well, you're going to get this thing that you want, and it's going to be decent, it's going to be all right, but then it might reverse for some reason. So that's the scenario here. So here's the important bit of nuance that I keep mentioning, what I call rejection. This is from Guido Bonatti's book of astronomy, Treatise 6 on questions. So this is in his book on Horary. And he discusses here how easily matters come about, from the easiest and most likely, which is a trine with mutual reception between both the planets, to the least likely and most difficult, which would be an opposition without reception. And you can see that trine, easy aspect, mutual reception. They absolutely love each other. They adore each other. It's easy and you really want it to happen. That's brilliant. And then you've got the most fraught. This is a really, really key point. If the place from which the Lord of the Ascendant or the moon is aspected by the Lord of the quesited matter, remember that means the planet that rules the house that you want, or the planet that rules the sign on the house of the thing that you want, is aspect. So if the Lord of the Ascendant, the place from which Lord of the Ascendant or the moon is aspected by the Lord of the quesited matter, or the place from which the lord or significator of the matter is aspected by the lord of the ascendant or the moon, is the detriment or fall of the one aspecting, the matter is not perfected, even if the aspect is a sextile or trine. Let's unpack that with a couple of examples. Easier to show than to tell. This is an example from Bonatti. He says, we have the sun in Aries applying to Saturn in a Leo rising horary about a marriage. So the reason he said that is because it's Leo rising. The sun ruling Leo will be the ascendant ruler. It will represent the queer, and it represents the person asking the question. And Saturn, because it's a question about a marriage, and if you've got Leo rising, you've got Aquarius on the 7th house, and the traditional ruler of Aquarius is Saturn. So Saturn would represent the potential partner. So you're looking at the sun as the person who's asking the question, and Saturn as their potential partner. And he's saying they're applying to trine. So great, right? Great. Trine is easy. The marriage is going to happen. And per Masha'Allah's rules, if you've got the planet, the sun, the ascendant ruler or the moon applying to aspect the quesited, the ruler of the house you're asking about, it's going to happen, right? He says, even if the aspect, however great in itself, is with reception, because the sun is in Aries, which is Saturn's fall, Saturn will not perfect the matter, but rather impedes it. He not only impedes it, but tries to destroy it if he can. Why? Because the sun is in Aries. This is the fall of Saturn. So it's like the sun, the person who wants to marry or get together with this other person, is going to them, and Saturn sees them as a threat. They're coming from a place, or they're behaving in a way that makes them feel like they'll bring them down, that they'll reduce them in some way. So Saturn's just going to go, no, thank you. I don't want that. So it's a trine. So this is going to happen easily. It's going to be friendly, but this is going to be a friendly rejection. And what's interesting about this is he says that the example he gives about Sun in Aries applying to Saturn in a Leo rising horary. Saturn's in frickin' Leo. Saturn is in the sign ruled by the sun. So there's reception here. The sun is receiving, but the other way round, there's rejection. And just one rejection is enough to destroy the possibility of this happening, which is why I get very frustrated sometimes listening to some astrologers who haven't really clocked this. Frawley's really good on this. And some astrologers are, some aren't. If you've got rejections, they really, really matter, because one rejection can scupper what otherwise looks like a perfectly functional aspect. It sometimes means you get part of the thing or a little bit of the thing, but you won't get the full thing. So this might be a perfectly friendly relationship between two people who get on very well. And one of them, probably the sun, really wants this marriage, and the sun's in a really good state. It's exalted in Aries. It looks great. It feels great. But maybe that Saturn has a bit of an imposter syndrome. Maybe that Saturn has a bit of a complex because it's Saturn in detriment, and it might really love that sun person. Saturn, the 7th ruler, is all the way over in the 1st house, and it's loving that ascendant ruler, but it's like, you're going to bring me down. You're too important. You're too big for me. You're going to drag me down somehow, you know? So, and this happens in real life all the time. You've got this setup between two people. One person loves the other. They're going together. They get on, but one of the people is like, this isn't going to work. And maybe it would, but they have this feeling that the other person's going to bring them down, rightly or wrongly. So that's one example. The second example Bonatti gives is a bit less explicit, so I've filled in some gaps here. In Bonatti's example, he says the moon applies to Venus from Scorpio. So the moon is in Scorpio applying to Venus. He doesn't say what sign Venus is in, so I've just made it up. I've said Venus is in Cancer. And he says here, a planet joined to any planet located in its own dissension always tries to destroy the matter and annul it. In other words, Venus, the moon is said here to be in the dissension of Venus. Dissension, he means here, the fall or the detriment, the opposite of exaltation or domicile. So Scorpio is the fall of the moon. So the moon is herself fallen in this chart, but most importantly here, she is in the detriment of Venus. So again, this is a friendly aspect. There's reception one way round, where we've got the moon receiving Venus, but Venus is rejecting the moon. So this is going to produce a friendly or a somewhat pleasant interaction that the person sort of wants, but Venus is going to reject the moon. Whatever that Venus is going to impede whatever the moon wants. And it's not going to impede it in a harsh way because we're not squaring or opposing. And Venus is a benefic, friendly planet. And in Cancer, she's pretty comfortable. So Venus is nice anyway. And here she's on pretty good behavior, but she's going to say no. So just a final point, technical point, just we got to get this idea of aversion, because for Masha'Allah's technique, we want to work out whether we're using the ascendant ruler or the moon. And the way we choose is we're looking at, does the ascendant ruler aspect the ascendant or not? What that means is it making a whole sign aspect to the rising sign? So if the ascendant ruler or moon is in the first sign, not house, sign, or any sign which aspects that sign, we can use it. If the ascendant ruler or the moon is in the second sign, the sixth sign, the eighth sign, or the 12th sign from the ascendant, that is said to be in aversion, meaning we can't use it. Those signs, because they don't make any because in traditional astrology, by the way, there is no such thing as an out of sign aspect. There are other things which can create a similar effect to an out of sign aspect, particularly this technique called Antisha, which I'm not going to go into now because it's a whole other thing. And this talk will be long enough as it is. But if you've got a planet in any of those signs, not houses, signs. So if you're using whole sign houses, then that simplifies this whole thing. If you're using quadrant houses, as I mostly do, then you're looking for this technique about the signs, because it's really signs that aspect signs in traditional astrology. And yes, we use orbs, and the tighter the aspect, the more powerful it is. And there's a big difference between an applying aspect, which means something that's coming up in the future, and a separating aspect, meaning something that's happened in the past. But it's signs that aspect signs. So the second, the sixth, the eighth, and the 12th sign from the ascendant sign don't have much power to affect the to do their job as far as the ascendant goes. If the ascendant is the person, yes, planets in these signs have specific meanings and can be relevant to particular areas of life, etc., but they are a bit disempowered. So that's why you wouldn't use them. So, right, to quickly reiterate his rules, and then we'll get into some example charts. This is his procedure in order. He goes, does the ascendant ruler behold the ascendant? In other words, is the ruler of the sign that's rising not in the 6th, 12th, 8th, or 2nd sign from the ascendant? If it isn't, you use that planet. If it is, rather, if it isn't in any of those naughty signs, if it is beholding the ascendant, if it's not in aversion to the ascendant, you use the ascendant ruler. If the ascendant ruler is in the 6th, 12th, 8th, or 2nd sign from the ascendant, in other words, if it's in aversion to the ascendant, that would indicate straight away that there might be some problems or delays, because the ascendant ruler is in a place where it can't really affect the outcome that well. So we then look at the moon. And is the moon beholding the ascendant? Is the moon not in the 6th, 12th, 8th, or 2nd sign from the ascendant sign? And if the moon is beholding the ascendant, if it's not in any of those signs that don't see it, you can use the moon. But if the moon is also in one of those signs that doesn't behold the ascendant, then you've got bigger delay or bigger problems. It means that the issue is even more out of the power of the querent or the person who's asking about the issue. If neither of them beholds the ascendant, your goose isn't cooked. Don't worry, there's still opportunities for things to happen. You look at which one is going on to make an aspect to another planet. It's often the moon, because the moon moves fast, but sometimes the ascendant ruler is going on to make a trine or a square or a sextile or something to a planet that does behold the ascendant. In other words, a planet in any of the other houses. So you look at which one of them goes on to aspect a planet which does behold the ascendant. And or they might say, say you've got the moon and the ascendant ruler in the 12th house. So neither of them are aspecting the ascendant. Maybe the moon goes on to aspect another planet in the 12th house, and that 12th house planet then goes on to aspect a planet in the 10th. It sextiles a planet in the 10th. So you work with the moon. In other words, it's a little relay race, and you see which one of them gets it out of that house. Or is either of them about to leave their sign? Maybe both of them are at the end of their signs, and one of them's about to pop off into another sign and make an aspect. Or behold the ascendant, and then you work with that one. This is, again, easier to show than to tell, but these are the principles. So let's do some chart examples. These are all taken from Masha'Allah's book on reception. And of course, because I'm mainly a medical astrologer, I'm going to work with the medical examples, and then I'm going to show you an example from my own practice. So this square chart format is the old school chart. So for anyone who's not familiar and is looking at this going, WTF, the outward pointing triangles are the angular houses. So those the triangles on all the squares. Do you see the square in the middle? The triangle's pointing out from that. So we've got 15 Virgo rising, and then the second house cusp is Libra. The third house cusp is Scorpio. The fourth house cusp is Sagittarius. The fifth is Capricorn, 6 Aquarius. Seventh house cusp is 15 Pisces. Eighth cusp is Aries. Ninth cusp Taurus. 10th cusp is that 15 degrees of Gemini, and so on. So it's initially a bit weird, but it does make clear which houses are angular. So that's, I think they use the square format because you've got very easily, you can see that the angular houses are so much more powerful than the others. And this format makes it clear which houses are angular. So let's look at this chart. So we've got Virgo rising, right? 15 degrees Virgo rising. So Mercury is the ruler of Virgo. So Mercury is Lord 1. Where is Mercury? Mercury is in Aries. Does Aries behold the ascendant? No, because it's in the 8th sign from Virgo. And remember, the 2nd, the 8th, the 6th, and the 12th signs from the rising sign do not behold the ascendant. So that immediately says that this person is in a situation where they feel they aren't in control of it. And obviously the 8th house is the house traditionally of anxiety, potentially of death. It's the house of chronic disease because it's stuff that happens to you until you die. So this person might be a bit anxious about dying, for example, or certainly anxious. But then we look at the moon because we can't use Mercury, the ascendant ruler. The moon, where's the moon? The moon is in Taurus. And does Taurus behold the ascendant? Yes, it does, because Taurus is the 9th sign. It's a sign which trines Virgo, right? So yes, it's beholding the ascendant sign. So we can work with the moon. So we work with the moon. So what's the moon doing? Well, the moon's doing Nafal to start with. It's strong in Taurus, which is a minor good. It's sort of saying, all right, maybe the person's anxious and feel disempowered, but the moon is pretty strong. So it might mean there's a bit of health going on in the background there. They've got some resources, but the moon's not doing anything for a while. It's void of course. Now, contrary to a lot of modern astrological lore, void of course doesn't mean nothing is ever going to happen. That is not true to life. Void of course just means a delay. In certain circumstances, if your whole question is about is anything going to come of this, then a void of course moon is one negative testimony because it implies a certain inertia or nothing changing for a bit in the situation, but it's not the be all and end all of a question. In this, what this is telling us is the ascendant ruler doesn't behold the ascendant, it's in the 8th house. It's also combust just as a second factor. It's right close to the sun. So that's showing that the person is anxious, disempowered, probably quite ill, not feeling great, worried. But the moon has a bit of power, but it's void of course. That isn't going to change for a while. That's all that's telling me. Then the moon moves into, where does the moon go? That's what we're looking at. So the moon's void of course for a bit. So nothing's going to change for a while. So that's one piece of information straight away. Then the moon changes into the next sign, Gemini. And what does it do? Well, none of these planets are retrograde. So the moon's immediate aspect after she changes sign is a square to Venus, because the moon goes into early Gemini and then will square Venus at 5 degrees Pisces. Can you see down there in the 6th house, just below that 15 degrees Pisces? That's the 7th cusp, remember. So the Venus is in the 6th house. So we've got the moon applying to square Venus. Is that bad? No, because Venus, it might be bad in an illness if Venus ruled a sign on the cusp of the 6th house or the 8th house or the 12th house, because the 6th house is the house of illness, the 8th house is the house of death, the 12th house is the house of hospitals or vices, or, you know, being stuck in places you don't want to be stuck in this context. But Venus doesn't rule any of those things. So that might indicate, although it's a square, so a bit stressful, so nothing happens for a bit, then stressful, and then maybe a little bit of relief, like maybe the symptoms are a bit palliated. Then what does Venus do? Well, Venus actually goes on to square Jupiter at 19 Taurus. Obviously, both of those planets will have moved on by then. But now, this is where you need to check your ephemeris. Obviously, I'm doing this using Masha'allah's example, so we're using a stationary chart. In real life, you absolutely need to use your software or an ephemeris, because it's quite possible that Venus could have squared Mars first, right? Say Jupiter was about, I mean, you can tell Jupiter's not about to turn retrograde because that only happens when it's at the trine of the sun, or when the sun's about to trine it. But Venus might have got to the square of Mars first, which would be a whole different outcome, because Mars doesn't receive Venus. Mars is the ruler of the 8th. That could have meant the person's in danger of death. And because Mars is in the 10th house of medicine, particularly as this is a question asked in the 9th century, maybe the person was given some dodgy treatment or some surgery, or they were bled to death or something. But that doesn't happen. What happens here, moon's void of course, changes into Gemini, squares Venus. So there's some stress involved, but maybe a bit of palliation. And then Venus goes on to sextile that Jupiter with this lovely mutual reception. So what's Masha'allah's explanation? So this is the chain of events. And then, just before I get into Masha'allah's exposition on that chart, another little quote from him. If the joining together is from the opposition or square aspect, there will be some difficulty, delay, and effort in the matter. If the joining is from the trine or sextile or conjunction, the matter will be without effort and without hardship. Again, remember, the aspects describe the manner in which the thing happens. They don't describe the quality of the thing. So the thing might be something you don't want. It's just that the sextile or the trine generally describe it's happening easily, and the square or opposition described with struggle. So this is what Masha'allah says about this chart. By their emptiness in course, the significators signified the prolonging and the severity of the illness. Well, what's he saying there? Mercury's obviously an aversion to the ascendant, but it's not making any further aspects. Now, if Mercury, the ascendant ruler, had been aspecting a planet, like say Mars had been at 26 Gemini in the 10th, and Mercury had gone on to sextile that Mars, there would have been a brilliant mutual reception there. That might have meant that some kind of surgery or medicine or treatment would have pulled them out of their illness. Because Mars rules the 8th house, it would probably have involved a bit of suffering, also because Mars, but it would have relieved it. But Mercury's not aspecting anything. So we're going to work through the moon, and the moon is also void. So that's all he's saying. Neither of them are aspecting anything in the sign that they're in. So that's going to delay things. And then he goes on, as I say, the moon changes sign, squares Venus, and then goes to sextile Jupiter. And he says Jupiter in this chart is the final dispositor, because Jupiter was not joined to Saturn. You can see Saturn's there in Aries in the 8th. And Jupiter was joined by none of the planets except Venus. Therefore, Jupiter signified that the ill person would come to health and prosperity, but that the illness would endure in a state of increase until Venus would be joined by Jupiter by degree. That's interesting. So he's saying, because that Venus is in the 6th house of illness, the moon's square to Venus, which I would say, based on my own experience, would bring some palliation or ease of symptoms. But because it's a square, there'd be some stress involved. So it probably would be incomplete. He's saying until Venus actually connects with that Jupiter, the illness is still going to be there. It's not going to resolve until that time, which I would agree, but I wouldn't say it would keep increasing until that, because Venus on her own, particularly in Pisces, where she's exalted, will relieve to some extent. I think that the good planets in naughty houses, like Venus or Jupiter in the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th, as long as they don't rule those houses, tend to like return the person to zero. They may not give like benefits above or beyond, but they'll palliate. They'll still try and help. If Venus were to have come to Mars, so he's saying in this example, let's say we had the moon applying to square Venus and then Venus squared Mars, and Mars did not receive her, which it doesn't, we would have said the querent would die, because Mars is the lord of the house of death, and death was the very thing the questioner was questioning, which you can see because the ascendant rulers in the 8th and combust, they're really worried about death. So here's his second example. Okay, so we've got 28 Leo rising, and we've got 28 Aquarius on the descendant. Of course, the midheaven is 15 Taurus. So the ascendant ruler here would be the sun. So the sun, we've got at 24 Aquarius on the descendant. And then the moon is at 28 Aries up in the 9th house. So we'll work with the ascendant ruler primarily, but the ascendant ruler isn't going anywhere. It's at the end of Aquarius, and it's about to pop off into Pisces, the 8th sign, where it doesn't aspect the ascendant. So the sun isn't aspecting anything before it leaves Aquarius. Because if you look at the other planets, we've got Venus at 11, Capricorn in the 6th house, Mercury at 2, Aquarius in the 6th, the sun at 24, Aquarius on the cusp of the 7th, Saturn at 4, Aries in the 8th, Moon at 28, Aries in the 9th, and Jupiter at 9 degrees Taurus in the 9th, Mars at 15 degrees Taurus just on the cusp of the 10th. I'm using the 5-degree rule, by the way, which is the traditional rule that if a planet is within 5 degrees of a cusp, you count it as being in that house. So the ascendant ruler, we're working with the sun, but the sun isn't going anywhere. It's going to pop off into Pisces where it doesn't aspect the ascendant. So we'll go to the moon. The moon is void. So they're both void. So this isn't quite as much powerlessness as we saw in the previous chart, because they both currently behold or aspect the ascendant, but there's still this sense of delay or stasis or things not happening immediately, like hanging about basically. Then the moon enters Taurus, where she gains a bit of dignity. And in Taurus, I think she immediately will go on to square that Mercury in the 6th house. And again, I'm going to look at what houses Mercury rules. Mercury rules the 2nd house because we've got Virgo on the cusp of the 2nd house. And Mercury rules, in this chart, it rules part of the 10th house because you can't see it, but we've got Taurus on the cusp of the 10th and Cancer on the cusp of the 11th, which means Gemini is somewhere wedged in the 10th. So that Mercury might have something to do with medicine, because remember I said the 10th house is the house of medicine and medical questions, the treatment, let's say, and the 2nd house is the house of what you put in your mouth. So that could be food, diet. It could also be medicines that you ingest. So the moon is going to go into Taurus. It's going to square Mercury. So maybe the patient doesn't like the treatment, or there's going to be some effort involved in the treatment, whatever. It's not, Mercury's not going to do any harm. It's not ruling the 6th house or the 8th house or the 12th house. Is not representing any of the difficult houses. Important point, reception. If you've got a planet that rules any of the naughty houses, the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th, if that planet receives, the difficulty is neutralized. This is why reception is so important, particularly in medical questions. So let's say, making things up, that Mercury ruled the 8th house in a chart, potentially a house of suffering or death or whatever. If the moon was to aspect Mercury from Gemini or Virgo, that difficulty would be neutralized because Mercury would be sort of like forced to look after the moon because the moon is its guest. It does work a little bit the other way around, but not quite as well. Let's say Mercury was in Cancer and Mercury ruled the 8th house, and the moon aspected Mercury. Well, then the moon is looking after Mercury, but Mercury, if it's ruling the 8th house of death or suffering, it's still going to bring some of that to the moon because it's the moon's guest and the moon's forced to look after it. But it's going to still alleviate it a bit. But it's better if you've got planet ruling a difficult house, if that planet receives the ascendant ruler or the moon, neutralizes the difficulty. Really important point. Anyway, in this chart, the ascendant ruler is not going anywhere useful. The moon isn't doing anything for the moment. It's void of course. Then it pops up into Taurus. It squares that Mercury. Mercury is not ruling any difficult house. Where does Mercury go? Mercury goes on to sextile Saturn. Here's the important point. Yes, Saturn is in the 8th house. Saturn is debilitated. It's in fall. It rules the 6th house of illness, but Mercury is received by Saturn. Mercury is in Aquarius. So there's a reception there. So that will neutralize a lot of the problems. Now, because Saturn's the final dispositor, I would imagine that this person might be left with a lot of lingering health issues to deal with. But the majority of the illness, the most dangerous aspects of the illness, will be resolved by that aspect because of the reception. This is what Masha'allah. So we look at it, but again, look at the ephemeris, because it maybe Mercury would have gone retrograde, and then that would have been a whole different kettle of fish, because then Mercury might have gone retrograde and gone on to square Mars or trine Mars or something. Now, if it had gone back into Aquarius and trine Mars, beg pardon, if Mercury had retrograded in this chart, say moon went forward into Taurus, squared Mercury, Mercury retrograded back into Capricorn and then trined Mars, that would still have been reception, because Mars, Capricorn is the exaltation of Mars. So that would have relieved it as well. But let's say, I don't know, something else would have happened. Let's say this, if you've had a different set of things, you've always got to check the ephemeris, is the point I'm making, basically, because things don't always go where you expect them to go at first sight. So this is just what I've already said. The sun changes into Pisces. The sun in Pisces does apply to sextile Jupiter, though, which, if you think about it, is a really similar vibe, because we've got the sun entering Pisces, which is the sign of the ruler, which is the ruler of the 8th house. We've got Pisces is on the cusp of the 8th house. So Jupiter rules the 8th. So Jupiter and Venus are generally good, but remember, any planet that rules one of the naughty houses, so-called the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th, can bring you problems. But if it receives, it's neutralized. And here we've got Jupiter, the planet higher up the authority chain, receiving the sun. So sun pops off into Pisces. The next aspect it makes is the aspect to Jupiter. In this case, we're going to prefer the moon because the moon moves so much faster. And both of them behold the ascendant. The sun isn't making a further aspect. Neither's the moon, but the moon is going to move a lot more quickly and then aspect Mercury, and Mercury is going to get to Jupiter before the sun does. But it's the same result either way. Mercury's going to get to Saturn, beg pardon, with reception, and then the sun's going to get to Jupiter. So what I mean by it being a similar vibe is that if we go by the moon, moon square Mercury, Mercury to sextile Saturn in the 8th with reception, Saturn in the 8th dodgy with reception, problems mostly neutralized. The sun entering the 8th sign of Pisces, going to aspect the rule of the 8th, but being received because Pisces is Jupiter's sign, neutralizes the problems. So there's this sense of like potentially getting closer to death and then the problems being alleviated. So this is an example of sort of like negatives to positives. And this is another example from Masha'allah. Follow me round this bend, folks. I'm aware that for some of you, I'll be like twisting your brain into a pretzel, but it's worth going back. This is going to be recorded to YouTube, so you can go back and rewatch this presentation or read Masha'allah, because there's a lot of meat in this, and the original book is definitely well worth the read. It's not long, but there's loads in it. So this is another example from Masha'allah. Malefics which do not rule purposes destroy matters. In other words, if you've got a planet aspecting Mars or Saturn and they're not in charge of that house that you want, or they're not dignified or they're not receiving, they'll generally knacker everything up for you. They'll stop the thing happening. But If that malefic commits its disposition to another malefic, meaning it goes on to aspect another naughty planet, which in turn receives the Lord of the Ascendant, the matter will be perfected. That sounds complicated. What it means is this: it's talking about a relay of aspects. Say you've got the moon that goes on to aspect Mars, and Mars doesn't receive the moon, and Mars doesn't rule the house that you're wanting. I don't know, let's say you want to, you question, you've got somebody asking a question about getting a place in a university they want to get to. So we've got the ruler of the ninth house. We're looking at the ninth house in general. Let's say we've got Taurus on the cusp of the ninth house, and the ascendant ruler Mercury, maybe it's tucked away in the 12th house and it's not aspecting anything. So we'll look at the moon. I'm just making this up off the top of my head. And let's say the moon isn't aspecting Venus, the ruler of the ninth. The moon is applying to a square aspect of Mars. Oh dear. And the moon maybe is in Gemini. No, let's say the moon is in Aquarius. Let's say the moon's in Aquarius applying to trine Mars. So Mars is just going to say no. So there's a trine, it's friendly, but Mars doesn't rule the ninth house. It doesn't receive the moon from Aquarius. It's going to say no. But then let's say Mars goes on to conjoin Saturn in Gemini. Then the end that Saturn does receive the moon. So this is what he's talking about. You can have an initial no that's converted to a yes if the planet at the end of that aspect relay receives the planet at the beginning. So there's more than one way to get that reception, is what he's saying here. This is another little get out of jail free card that can apply. If your planet's aspect isn't immediately received, but it's received by the planet that planet then goes on to aspect, it can get you the thing. So in this made up example, we've got the person wants to get into a university. The moon applies to trine Mars. From the moon's in Aquarius. The moon's in where have I put the moon? The moon's in Gemini, let's say, applying to trine Mars in Aquarius. Mars has no rulership of Aquarius. It has no rulership of the ninth house. Not going to get it. There's going to be a no. Might be a friendly no, but it'll be a no. And then Mars goes on to conjoin Saturn in Aquarius. Well, Saturn receives the moon. Is that right? No. Oh God, sorry. Moon in Aquarius. Moon in Aquarius goes on to trine Mars in Gemini, and then Mars goes on to trine Saturn in Aquarius. Or Mars goes on to trine or aspect Saturn anywhere. Saturn will receive that moon. So it's kind of like the planet in the middle can transfer the initial planet to the planet at the end. So complicated, I know. I didn't include any examples of this because this is a bit of a fringe one, but it's worth thinking about. So going back to this chart that we've just looked at, we've got in this chart both the sun in Aquarius is beholding the ascendant, the moon is beholding the ascendant. They're both void of course because the sun's not going to aspect anything before it leaves Aquarius. The moon's not aspecting anything before it leaves Aries. The moon's moving faster, so you'll work with the moon first and then look at the sun. And Masha'allah says the moon was being joined to Mercury because the moon enters Taurus and then squares Mercury. Mercury afterward committed his disposition to Saturn, meaning Mercury, 2 degrees Aquarius, moves forward to sextile Saturn and was received by Saturn because Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. Therefore, Saturn signified his health. It signified recovery. And he goes on to say the sun was being joined to Jupiter, which was the lord of the house of death. But Jupiter received the sun. Therefore, the sun also signified health and prosperity because of Jupiter's reception. Then he goes on to qualify. If Jupiter had not received the sun, so imagine that the sun had been much earlier in Aquarius. So maybe in this chart, the sun had been at 7 degrees of Aquarius, applying to square Jupiter and Taurus. You might think, oh, Jupiter's good, but Jupiter rules the 8th house here. then that could have indicated, particularly, as I say, this is the 9th century, the patient could die. In modern times, if you've got somebody literally on their deathbed, then maybe. Otherwise, it'd be a situation where you'd say, yeah, this is a bit of a serious situation. You might want to get yourself to a doctor now, or, just be really careful with the situation that you're in, sort of thing. When the Lord of the House of Death receives the Lord of the House of Life, the reception will be strong. But he says, if Jupiter had not received the sun, this would have been a testimony of death. When the Lord of the House of Life is joined to the Lord of the House of Death, it will signify death. So this is the point about whatever planet rules that house, it doesn't matter. It's going to do its job as the ruler of that house unless it receives reception, mitigates difficulties. So when the Lord of the House of Life is joined to the House of Death, it will signify death. Whether the Lord of the House of the Death is a fortune or an infortune, it signifies death, unless a reception which repels death intercedes. When the Lord of the House of Death receives the Lord of the House of Life, now this would be the other way round that I was talking about. So this might be, in this case, let's say the sun would be in Cancer, applying to a sextile of Jupiter. No, I'm talking rubbish, aren't I? Let's say Jupiter was in Leo in the ascendant. So then we'd have the sun applying to an opposition of Jupiter. Let's say that in this chart, Jupiter was rising at 26 degrees Leo, then you'd have the sun opposing to that Jupiter. Now there's still reception because the sun receives Jupiter. Obviously it'd be an opposition, so it'd be a much more difficult, challenging situation because it's an opposition. There is a reception though, but he says when the Lord of the House of Death receives the Lord of the House of Life, the reception will be strong. But should the Lord of the House of Life receive the Lord of the House of Death, this will be weak. Nevertheless, the Lord of the House of Death will not completely destroy. So it's kind of saying, yeah, the reception is going to palliate, it's going to help, but you really want the planet that rules the naughty house to receive. And again, think of this in terms of host guest. You want to be the guest of the planet that rules the naughty house, because then they're forced to look after you. If you're forced to look after the ruler of the naughty house, that's not going to be as good for you. Do you know what I mean? It's like reception is almost like they are forced to look after you. They're forced to pay attention to your needs. So the principles here, and then finally, I'm going to show you a couple of examples from my own practice. Well, one example in detail. Reception by domicile, that means by sign, or exaltation by any planet usually indicates a desired outcome of some sort. Remember, just because you want it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be great, but it shows you desire it. No matter the nature of the aspect itself just describes the ease or difficulty of attaining the thing. Aspects from the ascendant ruler or the moon to the quesited in this case just meaning the ruler of the sign on the cusp of the house, which represents a desired outcome or thing, indicate attainment. So in other words, if the ascendant ruler of the moon is going to that planet, which rules the house of the thing that you're asking about, the person will get it one way or another. It's better for a heavier planet to receive a lighter one than vice versa, all else being equal. Jupiter and Venus will usually give desirable outcomes, even if they don't receive, unless they are ruling or placed in difficult houses. And even so, they may be less harsh. But there are some exceptions to this, as I've found out in my practice. If Jupiter or Venus is very debilitated, if Jupiter's in fall or detriment, or Venus is in fall or detriment, then they can still indicate a little measure of palliation or relief. But the fact that it's in fall or debilitated will usually mean that won't last, or it'll fall apart. This is the thing about astrology, you sort of learn a technique and then you overemphasize that technique. But experience has taught me that's, if you've got the planet itself is in difficulty, then maybe that won't last, unless you've got another testimony that it will, as in that Masha'allah chart about the patient, where you had the moon in Aries moving into Taurus, going to square Mercury in the 6th, Mercury going to Saturn in the 8th, if that was the only testimony, I'd be like, yeah, the person might escape death, but they'll have a lot of chronic disease there. They might have some lingering symptoms. I'm sure they would from that. But because we've got the ascendant ruler going into Pisces and then sextiling that Jupiter with reception, we've got 2 testimonies in that chart that things are going to work out okay. So if the ascendant ruler was the sun didn't aspect Jupiter. It just went into Pisces and went through the whole of Pisces without aspecting anything. I'd be like, yeah, that's not so good. So unless they rule the house in question, Saturn and Mars, the 2 malefics, must receive in order to effect the desired outcomes. They have to receive unless they are really well placed in the house that you're asking about, in good dignity and by good aspect. I think if you aspect them by opposition and they're in good dignity and direct, then maybe, or by square, then maybe, but you'll probably still regret it. And even then there may be trouble. Reception is sort of like, that's the one thing that guarantees you definitely get the thing that you want with the malefics. I'll give you an example of that, actually, just a little trivial example. And this is just one of those little trivial day-to-day astrology things. I was traveling, it's in 2023. I was traveling back to visiting my family, and this was in just in sort of, I think, winter 2021, and we'd been locked down all over Christmas. I hadn't been able to leave London, hadn't been able to visit my family, spent Christmas alone. It was all crap, yada yada. And then I thought, New Year's, gonna go and visit the family. So booked the train ticket and everything, and the journey up was a nightmare. So I thought, right, for the journey back, I'm going to time my departure, because the government had lifted the restrictions on travel just after Christmas and around New Year's, just to allow people to party for New Year's, which is kind of nuts. But anyway, that it's inconsistent, let's say. But then I looked at the astrology, and it seemed to me that they were going to reimpose very tough lockdown laws again in January. So I thought, right, I'm going to visit and I'm going to travel then. So I thought, I want to travel before Wednesday that week. I want to go back to London before Wednesday that week. Otherwise, I'm going to be stuck at home. I was pretty sure. So I elected the time of travel. And I thought, I found time when the moon was in Libra, applying to trine Saturn in Aquarius. So that was a received trine. Now, at the time, I'm Scorpio rising birth chart. So Aquarius, although it's my 4th sign, is in my 3rd quadrant house. So I was like, okay, it's trining Saturn in my 3rd, but Saturn's dignified in Aquarius. The moon is trining with reception, should be okay. And then this was at the time when it was just after the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. So Jupiter was a couple of degrees after Saturn in Aquarius. So basically on that morning when I was traveling, my travel day began. I left the house when moon was trining Saturn with reception. And then a couple of hours later, it would go on to trine Jupiter. So this is what was fascinating. The moon was trining Saturn. I got on the train, no problem. At the exact point the moon trined Saturn, the exact point, the conductor came round and asked to see my ticket. I couldn't get the app to work. It wasn't working. So it's like, oh, you'll have to buy a new ticket. I was like, give me a minute. I'll find you evidence that I bought this ticket. So I showed him my bank details showing that I'd bought the ticket. And I was able to show him a photograph of the email proving that I'd purchased the ticket, but I couldn't show him the damn ticket. The conductor sort of like pulled a sour face and said, that's okay, I'll let you through this once, but you'll have to check at King's Cross. They're gonna check your ticket, so you might have to try and get your ticket by then. So he let me through, but he wasn't happy about it. By the time I got to King's Cross at the end of my journey, the moon was trining Jupiter. I got to King's Cross, all the barriers were wide open, nobody was manning the barriers, I sailed through. So this was a perfect example of how a dignified Saturn in Aquarius receiving the moon by trine is still a bit of a pain in the butt, but it'll let you get the thing that you want. You know, it's still Saturn. It's going to be like Saturn in Libra. It's going to play by the rules. It's going to want you to do the right thing. It's going to want you to produce the receipts, but it's going to give you it. You know what I mean? And it was friendly interaction. So it was so interesting. Anyway, Oh, I missed the last point, didn't I? The nature, condition, and placement of the final dispositor will describe something of the ultimate outcome. And this is really important. Again, this is something I've occasionally overlooked in the past, but experience has taught me not to do it. If your final dispositor is not in great dignity in a difficult house, there will be some difficulties associated with it, or even if it's not in great dignity or retrograde or something. So it'll tell you something about the nature of the thing. So finally, some timing rules. This is just going one step further if you want to try and time stuff. Whichever planet we're working with, whether it's the ascendant ruler or the moon, if they're directly aspecting the planet, that'll time the outcome. So whichever you're working with, the number of degrees to complete the aspect could be the number of days. The conjunction of the two planets in real time, in real life, in the sky, in angles or succeedent houses, if they're received or strong, could show you when it's happening, IRL. The transit of the ascendant ruler or the moon to the significator in the original chart, so transits of those planets to the original planet, the OG planet in the chart that you're looking at. This is all from Masha'allah. The significator conjoining the sun or heliacal rising, that means it's moving more than 15 degrees away from the sun, can show the thing happening, or the real-time completion of the aspect, the two planets moving to aspect in real time. I think this is way overly complicated, and certainly these things can help you confirm a timing, but there's a much simpler way. And generally, of course, the moon, Mercury, Venus, and the sun are going to be faster timing generally, and Saturn, Jupiter, Mars might be slower. But I think there's a much simpler way to do this. And this is from John Frawley's book, the Horary textbook. I don't agree with Frawley on everything by any means, but I think he's bang on the money with this one. As I say, I like his Horary textbook because to me it's the clearest and most precise, and predictively, I think he's pretty much he's on a level of his own. Really, he's very good usually. So houses, angles usually are slow, but they're powerful. So planets in angles generally represent things that you can access, but might last a long time. And they also might take longer to get there, unless you really want it, in which case they might be faster. So the way to think about that is angles are powerful. So if you want something to last and it's in an angle, it'll generally last longer. Succeedance and medium speed and cadence are fast because the sense of falling. But again, if it's something you want, cadence can be painfully slow. So the idea is succeedant houses are always medium in timing. Angles are fast if you want them to be fast, and slow if you want them to be slow. Cadence are fast if you want them to be slow, and slow if you want them to be fast. So that's my basic rule. More reliably, just look at the signs the planets are in. Fixed signs slow stuff down. Cardinal signs speed things up, and the mutable or bicorporeal signs are somewhere in between. So you can look at sort of like a fixed sign as being usually months or years, a cardinal sign as being usually days or weeks, sometimes hours, and a mutable sign as often being weeks or months. But again, it depends on context. If you're asking about when might I buy a house, a fixed sign might be years. But if you're asking about when will the postman arrive, a fixed sign might be a day, days, because it's the long unit of time if you're waiting for a parcel. So just remember, fixed is long, cardinal is short, and mutable somewhere in between. So units are context dependent. And the rule of thumb, as I say, is fixed signs generally are months or years, mutable signs weeks or months, movable signs days or weeks. So let's give you an example from our practice. So this is a horary chart of a patient with sciatica, and the patient is represented as usual by the ascendant, which is 23 Libra, which incidentally, not really relevant to this talk, but certainly relevant to the chart. I'm always happy when I see 23 Libra on an angle, because that is the position of the fixed star Speaker, which is probably the most helpful planet in the sky. It's sort of lucky, it's fortunate. It doesn't mean that everything will be brilliant, but it tends to indicate, particularly if it's rising, that the person will be fortunate, or that somehow things will work out. So that's always, it's like the title on the cover of the book from the star, because the fixed stars have more power than the planets. It's sort of saying good stuff will happen. So that's good. So we're looking at the ascendant ruler and the moon. So does the ascendant ruler, Venus, behold the ascendant? Yes, she does. She's in Cancer, which is the 10th sign. You can see she's in the 9th quadrant house, which is in the 10th sign. Beholds the ascendant, fine. We can work with Venus. Does the moon? Yes, the moon does. The moon's at the end of Gemini, void of course. Again, moon void of course here just means there might be a bit of a delay before things change, but Venus is in decent shape in Cancer. She's not afflicted, so she can do stuff. It's not a disaster. So what's happening with Venus? Well, Venus is actually separating from a square of Jupiter in the 6th house. And that's a mixed reception rejection square, isn't it? Because Venus is in Cancer, the sign where Jupiter is exalted. So it's kind of like that Venus was received by Jupiter, but Jupiter is in Aries, the sign where Venus is in detriment. So Venus is also rejecting Jupiter. So that's showing what's just happened. All things being equal, even though it's a square, I think because we've got the Jupiter, which has more authority than Venus, it's a more powerful planet than Venus, and it's a benefic, it's a friendly planet, and it's not ruling any of the naughty houses. It doesn't rule the 6th house, doesn't rule Aries on the cusp of the 6th. Jupiter doesn't rule Taurus on the cusp of the 8th. It doesn't rule Libra on the cusp of the 12th. So Jupiter's going to help. So Venus is kind of separating by square, which shows some effort from a planet that might have helped. But it's a weird thing because Venus is also rejecting that Jupiter. So it's sort of like signaling that the Venus might have rejected something that's helped or something like that. It's an interesting one. Masha'allah says a planet separating from reception is a kind of deformity. That's the word that he uses in translation anyway. So it usually means it's not desirable. But here you can see there's a mixed rejection reception going on. So the reception is more powerful than the rejection because the heavier planet receives and the lighter planet rejects, but it's a mixed bag. So Venus is moving away from some situation where whatever symptoms of illness they had were partly relieved, and they might have found it difficult to relieve those symptoms, and maybe they've rejected some of the things which were relieving the symptoms, or maybe the things that were giving them relief might have also been causing them problems. And this patient I know was over consuming painkillers and getting a lot of headaches, and the painkillers were relieving their back pain and they thought relieving their headaches, which they were. But there's this thing called rebound analgesia, which some of you may be familiar with, which is the thing where when you take a bunch of paracetamol regularly or a bunch of codeine or any of those drugs like cocodamol, you get tolerance to them and you eventually start getting rebound analgesia. In other words, withdrawal pain. So I think what this is describing, because Aries rules the head, is the person was taking these things which were relieving their back pain and their headaches, but the things were also giving them some withdrawal headaches as well. So that's the rejection and the square along with the reception. So interesting. Anyway, but Venus is moving away from that. So what's she going to do? So we're looking at Venus primarily. She's going to sextile that Mars. And Mars is the ruler of the 6th house of illness and the 7th house of the physician, by the way, on the cusp of the 8th house. Mars is not in great shape, in detriment in Taurus. The 8th house is the house of death or suffering or problems or whatever. There's a mixed bag here, isn't there? Because Venus receives Mars. Mars is in Taurus, ruled by Venus, but Mars rejects Venus, because Venus is in Cancer, the fall of Mars. And it's a sextile, which is an easy aspect. So this to me implies something like, because Mars rules the 6th house of disease, the person's symptoms or disease is getting worse because they're moving towards the rule of the 6th. And that disease is tending to become chronic or entrenched because it's in Taurus, fixed sign, on the cusp of the 8th house, which is chronic. It's sort of until death, it lingers. There are other things, by the way, in prognosis, which I'll be talking about in the course, like the fact that the angle, the ascendant here is a movable or cardinal sign. There's a movable sign on the cusp of the 6th. There's Jupiter in the 6th. These are all good signs for the thing not being actually permanent. Like movable signs or cardinal signs tend to shift things. And Jupiter in the 6th house will tend to relieve things if it doesn't rule the 8th house or the 12th house or whatever. So It's not as bad as it looks just looking at this Masha'allah chain of aspects, but still Venus is heading towards increased inflammation. But we do have the fact that it's a sextile, so it's easy, not necessarily good because it's easily getting worse, but there's a reception as well. There's a rejection and a reception. So it's kind of like, yeah, this is getting worse, but there's going to be some palliation or some ability to manage this as well, even though it's getting worse. That's the vibe that I get from this. And then that Mars is going to grind on through Taurus and oppose Saturn. So that is not great because we have here Saturn not receiving Mars. It's not receiving Venus. Because remember that earlier point of Masha'Allah's, if Saturn receives the first planet, then that would mitigate, even if it's a Mars-Saturn square like this. And Saturn's retrograde. So that to me indicates stuff getting worse, more inflammation, partial relief, and then the thing will, after a long period of time, because Mars is in a fixed sign, moving slowly towards that square of Saturn, also slow, retrograde, the issue will come back. And this is a patient with sciatica, as I say. And by the way, Libra rising is relevant for this because Libra rules, amongst other things, it's the kidneys, but it's also the lumbar spine. It's the lower back, which is the origin of sciatica. And sciatic pain is felt all the way down the legs, from the coccyx at the base of the spine down the legs. So we've got Saturn in Aquarius can represent the lower leg, and the ninth house where Venus and the moon are is the pelvis. So anyway, so the point here is, in terms of general prognosis, we've got that. And then the secondary indication, I'm also going to look at the moon because both of them aspect the ascendant. So why not? Well, the moon is void, right? It's not doing anything for a bit. But then the moon hops off into Cancer, which on its own is a fairly positive sign because it might show some gain in background health after a bit of a delay. And then what does the moon do? She goes to square that Jupiter. And that is a good reception, right? Because the moon's in Cancer, it's Jupiter's exaltation. The moon will be received when it goes to that square of Jupiter. So looking at that, we've got the primary thing, because we're working mainly from the ascendant ruler, is Venus in Cancer applying to sextile Mars in Taurus, which is mostly bad with a little bit of good. That's why I put a red cross and one little tick in brackets. And then Mars goes on to square that retrograde Saturn with zero reception involved. And Saturn doesn't represent anything that we want in this chart, which is not good. But then secondarily, we've got the moon void, of course, which is not great. Nothing's happening. And then when the moon gains in dignity, it enters Cancer, squares Jupiter in the sixth. That'll relieve greatly. Even if it's with effort, there'll be some relief. So what I did for the primary timing, I looked at how far has Venus got to go through Cancer before she sextiles Mars. And this is where you have to use your ephemeris or use your software, because it looks like Venus is going to complete the aspect at 13 degrees and 49 of Cancer, right? Because that's where Mars is in Taurus. But of course, Mars is moving as well. So actually, Venus doesn't complete that sextile to Mars until 19 degrees, 24 minutes of Cancer. So that's 10 degrees and 25 minutes. And because it's a movable sign, that's fast. So it could be 10 days. But it's a cadent house. So that could be fast or slow depending on whether you want it or not. So that could be days, weeks, or months. Probably on the faster end though, because it's a movable sign. Remember, the signs I'd say are more indicative. And then Mars will go to square Saturn. And because they're both in fixed signs, and Mars is one of the slower planets and so is Saturn, that's longer units of time. And that completes the aspect at 22 degrees and 24 Aquarius, because Saturn's moving retrograde. So Mars has to move exactly 3 degrees, which I'd say could be weeks, months, or years, probably years. So I think that's your primary, what's going to happen. But then got this secondary thing showing some measure of relief after a delay. So we've got the moon moving a couple of degrees through Gemini. And then at 8 degrees 42 Cancer, it will square Jupiter. So, and it's in a cadent house, it's in the 9th house. So I think it's moving 2 or 3 weeks or months in Gemini, and then 8 or 9 days or weeks. So how to make sense of all of this? This is too many possibilities, right? Well, you take a good guess and then you look at what's actually happening in the sky. And for my first one, I'm looking at aspects of Venus and Mars, and then Mars and Saturn. And for my second one, I'm looking at aspects of Moon to Jupiter. And I'm also looking at the transits to the base chart. So if I take my first relay, the main timing, the main event, the backdrop, we've got Venus moving to sextile Mars in 10 degrees and 25 minutes of Cancer. And we think it might be, it's fast because it's a movable sign, but it's maybe slower because it's a cadent house, and you sort of want Venus to be moving quickly, but she might not, because you don't have much power in a cadent house. So I'm thinking it could be days, weeks, or months. It's probably days, because you don't want her to aspect the rule of the 6th house. You don't want her to do it. So it's cadent house, so it probably will. So I'm thinking it might be 10 and a quarter days. So I looked at the sky and I had a little look at what was aspecting, and there was a Venus Mars aspect. I think it was the completion of that sextile in real time in early August that year. So I thought that'll be that Venus Mars, that the person, and indeed the symptoms, the sciatica got worse. They were put on a higher level of drugs, which helped a bit, but not much, which is what we'd expect, unfortunately. And then Mars went to square Saturn. Now, Mars has got 3 degrees to move before it squares Saturn. This is by the time, because remember, by the time Venus goes to Mars, Mars is at 19 degrees of Taurus, and Saturn's moving retrograde. So it has to move 3 degrees before it completes that square. That could be months or years. Well, if it was months, that might be early November 2022. But actually, as we'll go on to see, that was the timing that the moon gave of relief. So they got better then. So I'm thinking early August 2025, the symptoms might come back. And because this is an elderly patient, I think, these kinds of sciatica, it's usually disc compression in the lumbar spine. It's degenerative changes. So often you can reverse a thing and it might come back when the person's run down, or if they have a fall or something like that. So I'm just going to keep my eye on that. So looking at the moon moved a couple of degrees in Gemini, and then 8 degrees 42 in Cancer. So a couple of degrees medium, and then 8 or 9 fast. So I thought that might be 2 or 3 weeks or months, Gemini, and then 8 or 9 could be days or weeks. So it turned out to be the longer timing. So looked at 2 or 3 months, and then 8 or 9 weeks, and early December 2022. And indeed, at that time, everything got relieved completely. So all this person has currently is a little bit of back pain when they get up in the morning, which goes after about 20 minutes. But I'm just keeping an eye on them because they're a longer term client. I'm suspecting they might have a flare up of inflammation around August next year. So we'll see. But again, that speaker rising gives me hope. And just on a medical astrology level, the ruler, the 10th house of medicine has that sun in Leo ruling the 10th. Super, super positive. You want to see the ruler of the 10th house of medicine having a lot of power in the 10th house. That's great. It shows that medicines can be very helpful. So just a quick review of what I've covered in this talk, because I know I've covered a lot of material. As I say, you might want to rewatch this, go back over it, and I'd certainly recommend getting a copy of On Reception. It's not a long book, but there's a lot of great astrology in it. So the review of the principles, you work from the ascendant ruler or the moon, whichever beholds the ascendant, or next aspects a planet beholding the ascendant. The final dispositor, or the last planet in the aspect relay, shows the final outcome, and preceding aspects show intermediate events, what happens along the way. The acquisition of the desired outcome, that's the main thing that the person might want, is often through aspect to the ruler of the house, or the ruler of the sign on the cusp of the house that you are asking about, or any planet in that house, including Mars or Saturn, as long as they are very well dignified, and receive, or just very well dignified and not by a bad aspect, or very well dignified, or even if they're badly dignified but they receive you, they'll generally give you a good. That's if you're wanting a specific thing. Like if you want some money, then aspect to a planet in the second house will give you that money. Now, if that planet is in its fall, it might be a pathetic amount of money, but it will generally give you it. If that planet is Mars or Saturn and it's really well dignified, like it's Mars in Aries or Capricorn, it'll give you money, and it might give you a decent amount. You might have to work for it, but it will give you some of what you're asking for. Or if it's a weak Mars or Saturn, like say it's Mars in Cancer, but you're the moon in Scorpio, or the moon is in Scorpio applying to trine that Mars, again, it will give you some money. Not a lot, because Mars is not very strong. It's debilitated, but it will give you some of it. But if the aspect is to Mars or Saturn and they don't receive, then it's not going to give you anything. It's going to say no. If you've got an aspect to a planet by any aspect, like with reception, or you've got an aspect to Jupiter or Venus, and they're not associated with the house. Let's say the person's asking about money, and the moon is applying to aspect Venus, and Venus has nothing to do with the second house, which is the money you have in the bank, or the 11th house, which is the house of wages or money that you get from work, because it's the second from the 10th. It's also the house of good luck. If Venus isn't ruling those houses, then, or maybe even the 8th house, that like your partner's money or someone else's money. Say it's you're waiting for a client to pay you. If you're working with clients, then the 8th house would be their money, because it's the second from the 7th. But let's say Venus doesn't rule any of those houses. The moon's aspecting Venus. You'll get something, because Venus will give you something, because that's what Venus does. Or maybe the moon's going to aspect Mercury and the moon's in Gemini or Virgo. Then you'll get something. It might not be exactly what you want or where you think it's going to come from, but it'll be a desired outcome anyway, something that you sort of want. But you'll get reversal or failure if that planet retrogrades or is cadent, because it'll fall away eventually. And if it's in poor dignity, that might be less than you expect, or a less good outcome. In medical terms, if the planet is in its fall or detriment, then even if there's a reception or a mutual reception, that might give you good relations or some kind of initial positive. But if it's in its fall, maybe there'll be less benefit than expected, or it might sort of fall apart. And malefics will deny outright if they're not receiving the planet, or they're not ruling the house that you want, or placed in it and very well dignified. And my final point that I've added from Bonatti is always look out for rejections, because if there is a rejection, no matter how good the aspect, the thing will be resisted in some way. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have a terrible time with it. It just may describe a situation. To give you a final example, I remember some years ago, I'd met somebody I thought might make a good partner. And so I did a horary, as you do if you're an astrologer and you're addicted to astrology, as I am, and I assume many of you are. And it was a Leo rising chart. So I was the sun in this chart, and I was in Aquarius. It was a time when Sun was in Aquarius. So Sun was in the 7th house, which in relationship charts show that you are really interested in that person. You've gone all the way over to their side of the chart. And the Sun was applying to a trine of Saturn, which is great, because that's like, oh, look. And the Sun is in Aquarius. It's received by Saturn. Where was Saturn? Saturn was in Libra and retrograde. So Saturn is in the fall of the Sun and retrograde. So this is one of those rejections. And that was a really interesting situation, because it showed somebody who's now a friend and has been a friend for many years, and I'm sure will be forever. It was a good relationship with this person, really get on with them, but I sort of rejected them initially because I was like, I'm not sure this will work. And I think with good reason, because even though Saturn was, so it's like the inverse of that example, pretty much exactly that Bonatti gave with Leo rising and the Sun in Aries and Saturn in Leo. It's the opposite of that. Where so in this case, so it's a weird combination of a chart. You have the Sun, which is me, going all the way over and applying to aspect the Saturn. So in Horary, say the planet that is applying is the one that's most interested. So I'm the one making the effort, going to that person. I'm definitely interested in them, but then something about them makes me go no. But because Saturn was retrograde, there's also this sense of after completion, the thing doesn't work. So there was two testimonies there in that otherwise very positive aspect. And the retrogradation, because it's mutual application, shows things happening suddenly, which they did. We sort of had a couple of surprise meetings or like last minute arranged meetups and whatever, but this person's become a great friend. So the aspect in and of itself showed a positive outcome, but marriage, relationship, no. So that's how a rejection can inflect or modify an otherwise apparently perfect aspect. So anyway, I think I'm going to end it there and see if there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for an absolutely brilliant presentation. Your ability to take a complex topic and deliver it in such a wonderfully palatable and humorous way is just on a different level. That's just not me. Check out the chat as well.
Thank you. Oh, I turned that off when it was going because I didn't want to be distracted. So,
absolutely brilliant, fantastic. And just to reiterate, we'll have the recording on our YouTube channel. And because I'm so excited to rewatch this replay, I'm going to work on the edits tonight, this evening, and I'll get this replay posted by tomorrow on our YouTube channel by around noon Eastern time. So check out your time zones. It'll be around noon Eastern tomorrow on Sunday. So wonderful. Okay, we are well over, but let's go into the Q&A because this is
thanks
to stop. It's too good to stop.
Thank you. It's good. Shall I go through the questions in the thing, or shall I let you compare it and just?
Yeah, I'll go through the questions and then you can go through it. Right. So let's see what we've got here. And I will apologize if we don't get to every question. So let's see here. I think this is referring to the foundation of Baghdad chart. So Cheryl is asking, with Mars in Gemini in the 7th, depending on where Mercury is and how it is aspected, could there have been duplicitousness inviting hostility? Could this have been an election based on intellectual activity at high levels, volumes of writing, and associations with others that foster this? Hope you've got all of that.
Could be. I know where you're going with that. That's an interesting question. I'd have to see the chart, to be honest. It's been a few years. I just remember he brought that chart up, and you're absolutely right. I would want to know what Mercury was doing and what the rest. All I can remember, the only feature of the chart I can remember is that Jupiter was rising in Sag. So that's great. Obviously implies that the city is going to be good, center of knowledge, successful, and everything. It was just this weird choice of having Mars in Gemini applying to an opposition on the 7th. But no, she's absolutely right. If you've got Mercury somewhere, that would definitely.
I think that Mercury was in the 8th. Was it near the late degrees of Cancer?
I can't remember, Callum. I'd have to see that. Right. But if it was, that would be even more interesting and spicy, wouldn't it? Because that'd be like, okay, it's putting it in the 8th house. So yeah. Fantastic. I don't know is the short answer, but you'd have to look at that chart. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Forgive me if you've answered some of these questions. I've had to do things in the background here. Question here is, I thought Mars and Saturn can receive each other only by conjunction, sextile, or trine, not by the other aspects.
Oh no, they can certainly receive. It's just not going to be much fun. So it's like any planet can receive any other planet by any aspect. Mars and Saturn can still receive each other from the square or opposition. It's just going to be pretty hard or outright grim. So if you've got, I think that example, that made-up example that Masha'allah gave of like the Mars in Capricorn where it's exalted squaring that Saturn in Aries where it's in full is kind of like a voluntary ordeal, like an obstacle course or something that you put yourself through, some unpleasant. That's the vibe I get from that. So the aspect just describes the nature of the interaction. And then when you've got the two malefics, I think the reason they said they can't receive in those aspects is it doesn't mean they can't receive. Reception will always mitigate or improve a situation. It just means that the situation is likely to be not very pleasant at all. Thank you, Callum, and thank you, Laurie, and thank you everyone for hanging on this long, because I know this has gone way over the time, but I appreciate it. So
I'm going to join again. I'm going to get a cup of tea. I'm going to sit tomorrow and watch the whole thing, and I can pause and you guys can screenshot. I don't know if you can see all the hearts coming through, but absolutely.
Oh, thank you. I can. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.